post-war middle-class expansion policies. The disproportionate power of the South to oversee the shaping of federal policies is how transformative legislation such as the Social Security Act was able to pass with 77 votes in the Senate, because the Southern lawmakers were able to exclude its benefits to the people in minority-dominated professions such as agricultural workers and domestic servants, jobs that were also excluded from the newly created unemployment insurance program. Because as everyone knows, farm workers and maids don't need a social safety net after they retire. And of course, black people were also denied the opportunity to join unions and receive home loans because of redlining and restrictive covenants, and were made to absorb the negative impact of infrastructure projects and electrification due to the fact that highways and toxic energy facilities were built in their neighborhoods. To this day, black people continue to disproportionately suffer from the health consequences of air pollution caused by the implementation of these policies, regardless of their economic class. In reference to the crafting of the GI Bill, Ira Katznelson writes, "Written under Southern auspices, the law was deliberately designed to accommodate Jim Crow. Its administration widened the country's racial gap. The implementation and enforcement of legislation in the Jim Crow era was intentionally put into the hands of local and state governments, which allowed them to cut black people out of the benefits of these laws." Katznelson writes, "A survey of 13 Mississippi cities by Ebony magazine found that of the 3,229 VA guaranteed home, business, and farm loans made in 1947, precisely 2 had gone to blacks. And one of the main mechanisms that the South utilized to exert such influence over these policies, even though they comprised a minority of the legislative body, was the Senate filibuster." But wait a second, I thought that
it has no racial history at all. None. So there's no dispute among historians about that.
The Turtle's dad from Robin Hood is right about one thing. There is no dispute among historians about the racial history of the filibuster, because the filibuster does in fact have an incredibly racist history. While it seems to have been inadvertently unleashed by that guy who shot Lin-Manuel Miranda, the obscure Senate rule that defined the mechanism to end debate on a bill became exploited by one of the great racist villains of American history, John C. Calhoun, who used this loophole to protect the interests of slaveholders. Over time, this totally random, unintentional rule that's not in the Constitution and can be overturned at any time by a simple majority vote grew in its ability to, in essence, give veto power over many forms of legislation to a minority of senators. For decades, this tool was primarily used for the purpose of blocking civil rights and anti-lynching laws. And even just the looming threat of the filibuster was taken advantage of by the Dixiecrats, who had developed seniority power through the proto-fascist one-party rule in the South to shape legislation in order to maintain the Southern way of life, which was, of course, not so subtle code for white supremacy. During the Jim Crow era, when white supremacy was an explicit aspect of American life codified into law, and the benefits of massive government spending efforts could be easily denied to black people, the opposition to large government spending programs failed to coalesce. The white majority population was perfectly happy for the government to spend vast amounts of money to make their lives better, as long as it came along with the assurance that black people would be mostly left out of the deal. By contrast, in the brief periods of our history where the rights and enfranchisement of black people in this country were actually enforced to some degree, white supremacists masked their appeals through the colorblind packaging of austerity politics, which benefited the ruling class. Appeals for austerity were never popular because voters never really cared about the budget or deficits or government spending. This was always just the wrapping paper covering the real package, the promised benefits of white supremacy. It's the equivalent of your boner pills arriving in discreet packaging. When the rights of freedmen were protected by the government during Reconstruction, they resorted to austerity politics. And then, after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended explicit legal segregation and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected the right of black people to vote, it's not a coincidence that they resorted to austerity politics yet again. Which gives us some insight into our current moment, because it is also no coincidence that Donald Trump was the first president elected after the Voting Rights Act was gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013. And even though Trump absurdly promised to entirely eliminate the national debt, he also proudly proclaimed,
"I'm the king of debt. I'm great with debt. Nobody knows debt better than me. I've made a fortune by using debt. And if things don't work out, I renegotiate the debt. I mean, that's a smart thing, not a stupid thing.
And sure enough, he grew the national debt by $7.8 trillion in just 4 years. During his presidency, Trump almost entirely discarded the discreet packaging of austerity messaging and instead focused on the real selling point for the Republican base: white dick. Trump was the monster from the conservative id. For such a monumental liar, Trump further exposed the brutal truth. It was never about the debt or the level of government spending. It was always about who's in charge and who should be in charge culturally, economically, and politically. We know full well what the answer to that question has been throughout American history, which is why today's complete abandonment of austerity politics in favor of cancel culture hysteria is not really that surprising. This moral panic is just a frenzied attempt to reassert cultural dominance, because at its core, cancel culture is about who's in charge. Most of these controversies are really about white people being mad that they aren't allowed to be homophobic, misogynistic, transphobic, anti-immigrant, or racist anymore. And this has become even more clear as the right has started to shift focus from their concerns over how cancel culture supposedly limits the free exchange of ideas in favor of literally trying to cancel a school of thought known as critical race theory, even though they have no idea what it actually is.
Does it reinforce the Oedipal notion all kids have of wanting to kill their father and marry their mother?
Now, as I mentioned, we at Cody's Shody will have a lot more to say about this latest boogeyman concocted by the right. But for the purposes of this video, the main thing you need to know is that the aim of this latest endeavor by the GOP to create a moral panic over the idea of critical race theory accomplishes the exact same goal as the cancel culture frenzy that they've been promoting: to incite the fear in their base of support that white people's cultural, political, and economic status in society is under threat by black people and woke ideology and communism. But it's actually the same old story. Only now they have the license to be more explicit about it, in a way that they haven't been able to do since before the civil rights era. And while all of this comes across as ridiculous and embarrassing, because it is, the fact is that an ideology based on white supremacy is no laughing matter. These jerk-offs looked pretty ridiculous too. And even though all of this cancel culture and critical race theory absurdity is seemingly devoid of any discernible policy agenda, the same forces that animate this cultural grievance also motivate the political counterpart to this philosophy, which can be best described as a brazen power grab and a reassertion of white supremacy. Now, we've recently seen the banning of critical race theory in several states. Florida has banned the teaching of, quote, the theory that racism is not merely the product of prejudice, but that racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems in order to uphold the supremacy of white persons. So in other words, this legislation is banning the teaching of the truth of American history, canceling it, however you want to put it. And even more significantly, Republicans have introduced hundreds of voter suppression bills throughout the country and have passed 22 new laws across 14 states in this country, all enabled by the gutting of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, paradoxically accelerated by the changes of voting laws in response to the pandemic that resulted in historic turnout, and justified by the lie spread by Donald John President, that the election was stolen from him by black people. Quick note, the Supreme Court has recently just struck another blow to the Voting Rights Act. I wonder who that will give us this time. It's probably just the same guy, honestly. That'll be fun. In a sick twist of irony, the death of austerity politics may coincide with the rebirth of Jim Crow. Trump's election big lie also incited the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. And it's no surprise that a recent study found that racial and cultural anxieties, also known as racism, were the underlying forces responsible for this insurrection. And if you thought that this was our nation's only failed coup attempt driven by white supremacy, you'd actually be right, because the last coup attempt was a complete success. As a brief historical aside, in 1898, the city of Wilmington, North Carolina was a mixed-race community with a multiracial coalition of elected representatives and a thriving black middle class, perhaps the last holdout of the Reconstruction era. But following the elections that year, a mob of 400 white supremacists burned down the city's black-owned newspaper and murdered an estimated 60 black people in the streets on their way to violently overthrowing the democratically elected government and inserting white supremacists in their place. In his book, Wilmington Washington's Lie, David Zucchino describes how the politicians had been marched through the city, harangued by white onlookers, and shoved aboard trains at gunpoint. And they 100% got away with this. It was a completely successful coup d'etat. You see, you don't need to hide your white supremacy when there are no consequences for it. But back to the issue at hand. The other nail in the coffin for austerity was the fact that, as a result of the mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic, hundreds of thousands of citizens died, and America suffered the highest rate of unemployment since the Great Depression. And capitalism and the free market had no solution to this problem. And as a result, more Americans than ever wanted the government to help. The 9 most terrifying words in the English language,
I'm from the government and I'm here to help,
have been replaced by help is here, but like not a Reagan voice, like a Biden voice, and have been met with a 75% approval rating, a number typically reserved for puppies and the Great British Baking Show. This shift is probably why you've been seeing all sorts of think pieces coming out asserting that the Reagan Revolution is officially over. And in many ways, this is true, but not necessarily because this ideology was defeated, but perhaps because it has been completely victorious. One of the other reasons the right wing is so devoid of policy today is because in many ways, the conservative movement has become a victim of its own success. The Reagan Revolution won. This is not to say that their theories were correct or that this was a success for the American people. On the contrary, this agenda has been an unmitigated disaster for the vast majority of Americans, except of course for the very few at the top. But short of a handful of items on their bucket list like privatizing Social Security, they basically did what they set out to do. They cut every tax for the rich they could get their hands on, got rid of every regulation they could find, and succeeded in their effort to turn nearly every aspect of American life into a marketplace and redefine the very identity of a citizen into that of a market participant. For conservative ideology, the free market is a naturally occurring phenomenon. The invisible hand of the market is akin to an edict from God. In addition to the stock market and the housing market, we have the healthcare market, the energy market, the education market, the dating market, the marketplace of ideas, the labor market. Everything is a f***ing market. The Reagan Revolution succeeded in convincing Americans to look at every interaction as if it were a commercial transaction, to consider every decision in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, as if you were buying a set of Tupperware. By the way, I would highly recommend using glass Tupperware. It just keeps everything so much more fresh. But the point is that under this ideology, the highest form of civic participation is that of engaging in the market in order to maximize your personal profit at the expense of others. And if you can't cut it, too bad. The argument has been that human nature seeks power and profit, and the natural order of the universe to harness and maximize this energy is the free market, a kind of social Darwinism absent of government interference. In his book, Freedom from the Market, Mike Congsel writes, "Over the past several decades, we've been fed an idea that free markets, the unregulated flow of goods, services, and labor, are the fundamental form of freedom, and that freedom itself functions like a market. The freedom of a business owner, the freedom to sell your labor, the freedom to buy the necessities of life like health and education. These are the market opportunities that keep us free and allow us to express ourselves as members of a society." As a result, during Reagan's administration, we moved away from the notion that an educated population was a worthy investment for the good of the country as a whole. And so we cut government grants for higher education and instead vastly expanded the student loan system. We asked individuals to decide if the debt incurred by pursuing higher education was worth their future earning potential. Another non-coincidence is the fact that this shift in educational funding came just as more black people began to participate in higher education. As Heather McGee writes in her book, The Sum of Us, over this period of growth among students of color, ensuring college affordability fell out of favor with lawmakers. State legislatures began to drastically cut what they spent per student on their public colleges, even as the taxable income base in the state grew. And throughout the education system, instead of fostering a love of learning, our schools became a capitalist spin-off of Survivor, competitive boot camps that purported to train children for the job market with the ultimate goal of making as much money as possible. Competition was valued over collaboration or community, and this all coincided with efforts to privatize education itself and turn it into a profit-making endeavor as opposed to a public good. And simultaneously, Reagan halted the regular increase of the minimum wage on a yearly basis, stating that the minimum wage has caused more misery and unemployment than anything since the Great Depression, as he crippled the power of labor unions to collectively bargain for higher wages and better working conditions. These policies may have been sold through racist dog whistles and appeals to white supremacy, but the project was even more expansive. This is not to say that white supremacy was incidental to this endeavor. In fact, white supremacy, the patriarchy, the class system, and the caste system are all essential components to this effort. Any structure that creates a hierarchy is critical to this mission. And while the belief systems of white supremacy and anti-blackness exist both independently and in concert with the ideology and goals of the ruling class, there is no doubt that free market zealots utilize the power of racism to accomplish their goals and realize their vision. Welfare, according to this ideology, is out-of-control spending that creates a culture of dependency. On the other hand, tax cuts for the wealthy is freedom that will trickle down and help everybody. Reagan and the believers that followed told us that all of these policies would unleash the potential of the free market, an endeavor that would save America.
With you died our life.
No! And of course, the very notion of a free market is a lie. Modern markets only exist within the context of government, and our government is far from a neutral arbiter. In fact, the very aim of these policies was to shift the balance of power away from the working class and poor and in favor of the rich and powerful, away from the workers, and even further in favor of the owners and bosses. To better illustrate this dynamic, the Some More News team has created a reenactment of your typical job interview, if the nature of the disproportionate power dynamic were honestly reflected. Action! Say action. 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 Roll the thing.
So tell me, Wanda, what do you think makes you the best person for
With
this
you
job?
died our last hope.
I'm a very hard worker. I'm very detail-oriented, and I'm a great team player.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Oh, what would you say
With
is your
you-
greatest weakness?
Oh, probably that I work too hard. Just a little joke.
Or you're too funny. I'm not, but...
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I love it. Okay. Well, your resume is excellent. Let me ask you this question. Do you want to live?
I'm sorry, I don't think I heard you right. Can you repeat that question?
Oh, the connection's off? Okay, yeah. Do you want to live? Or do you want to continue being alive?
I don't understand that.
Oh, it's a perfectly reasonable question. Look, you have student loan debt, right?
Well, yeah, a lot, actually.
And I assume you're going to need money to pay that off, right?
Yeah, I do.
And you
But
want health
I-
insurance, right?
Yes, I do.
And I assume you're going to need shelter, right? You need a way to pay rent.
Of course, I've got to pay rent.
And I'm going
I
to
mean,
bet you're going to need food to stay alive, right?
Yeah, girls got to eat, you know.
Right, so let me ask you a question again. Do you want to live?
Yeah, of course I want to live.
Doesn't really sound like you do.
No, I do. I do want to
Because
live.
I have a
though.
whole bunch of other people who've applied for this job who really, really want to live.
I want to live, though.
But do you?
I do. I really do.
Say it.
I want to live.
What's that?
I want to live.
Say it again.
I want to live. I want to live.
Are you willing to work weekends?
Yes, I'll work whatever weekends you want me to work. I'll do whatever you want.
It's a terrible and soul-crushing job.
Yeah, that's okay. I don't care. I just
The
want to
working
live.
conditions are deplorable.
Yeah, that's what I like. It's my favorite kind of condition.
You're hired.
Oh my God.
Yes.
Oh God, thank you. Oh, that was so close.
Oh, yeah, no, congratulations. You can continue being alive.
Oh, that's such a relief.
All right, so can you start today?
Oh, actually, I have a few things that I have to sort out
Okay,
first.
you're
but,
fired.
you know, no.
So I guess the question is, will President Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. do anything to fundamentally change this power dynamic between those in charge and everyone else, so that this job interview is not possible in our society? Because even though Joe Biden has told us that
in order to grow the economy a year, 2, 3, and 4 down the line, we can't spend too much. Now's the time we should be spending. Now's the time to go big.
He also told his rich donors that nothing would fundamentally change. And there's not necessarily any contradiction between these two statements. Biden can spend a whole lot of money and go big without fundamentally changing anything. Republicans have done this successfully for the last 50 years. The question is, what are you spending the money on, and who does it benefit? There is no doubt that the American Rescue Act is a good bill that will help a lot of people who need help, but most of the provisions in this legislation will expire in a year from now. That is not fundamental change, and fundamental change is what is desperately needed. In his recent address to a joint session of Congress, Biden outlined his vision for America, and putting aside his saber-rattling about China, that's a topic for another episode, his domestic policy agenda is allegedly the most ambitious since LBJ. It doesn't go nearly far enough, but it's better than having a Democratic president enthusiastically declare that.
The era of big government is over.
Or having a Democratic president propose reducing the deficit by making cuts in Social Security and Medicare. Instead, Biden denounced white supremacy as domestic terrorism and took a shot at the Reaganomics that have dominated our politics for 40 years.
My fellow Americans, trickle down. Trickle down economics has never worked. And it's time to grow the economy from the bottom and the middle out.
But I wouldn't start calling him Joseph Robin Hood Biden Jr. just yet. It's not his name. It would be disrespectful. But also, because another prominent aspect of his speech was that he insisted that his proposals would not increase the deficit. Joe, have you not been paying attention to the episode you're definitely watching? Have you not liked and subscribed to this channel more than once? You did it at least once, Joe, I know it. Nobody cares about the deficit anymore. It's a good thing to raise taxes on the rich, but that's because we desperately need to reduce income inequality, not because we need the money to rebuild our infrastructure or increase help to families. So don't limit your political program because you think people are worried about the deficit or debt. Just do them because they don't care. Because unlike tax cuts for the rich, which Biden rightly pointed out have been falsely sold as paying for themselves, investments in infrastructure and early childhood education actually do pay for themselves. And it's worth taking a moment to acknowledge the irony that of all the people to become the president during this moment in our history, when neoliberal austerity politics is losing its grip and the country is undergoing the most significant reckoning over our history of systemic racism in decades, we get Joe Biden. A guy that played a significant role in shaping the bankruptcy bill that is a major contributor to our student loan crisis, and was one of the main authors of the crime bill that has contributed to the era of mass incarceration and systemic racism over the last 25 years. And while it is good that Biden has proposed universal pre-K, as always, the devil's in the details, because this proposal would rely on partnerships with states, which is one of the main ways that the benefits of large proposals were denied to black people during the New Deal and post-World War II era. It's why there are still 12 states, mostly in the former Confederacy, that have opted out of Medicaid expansion, despite the fact that these states would actually make a profit if they adopted the provision, a move that would dramatically reduce racial disparities in health. And therein lies the rub, because it is not that hard to imagine a world where universal pre-K is actually passed, but implemented in a way that continues to widen the racial gap in education. The fact is that austerity and systemic racism need to be tackled simultaneously. Otherwise, our politics are destined for an endless game of whack-a-mole, because austerity politics and anti-black racism in America have a symbiotic relationship. White supremacy will constantly find new ways to reinvent itself, and the wealthy ruling class will always find ways to leverage racism for their own selfish goals. And this dynamic hurts everyone. And now is your opportunity, Joe! Pass your agenda you allegedly want to pass, while the Republican opposition is either hyper-fixated on the supposed dangers of wokeness or are literally asleep. For example, cancel student debt. You're not going to, but you could do it tomorrow with the stroke of a pen, and it would both stimulate the economy and reduce the racial wealth gap. And maybe spend trillions of dollars on infrastructure. Not that 2 trillion shit, 6 trillion, who gives a Challenge Joe Manchin to a push-up contest to get rid of the filibuster. Give Kirsten Sinema a season pass to Candyland. I don't care. Do what you can to ram through your insufficient, but at least there's some decent stuff in their agenda, like a $15 minimum wage and the PRO Act. Hey, remember when you're compromised a single-payer healthcare was a public option, and now, like, you don't even mention that as something you want to do, and allegedly the left is okay with that? How did we suddenly take healthcare off the agenda after a global pandemic? Also, the For the the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Do those please if you can, or we could easily descend back into Jim Crow the sequel and be condemned to a continued era of white supremacy and austerity and ultimately climate catastrophe. Take the opportunity to be the FDR 2.0 that people won't shut the f up about how you are, but this time, you can include everyone in the deal. And maybe this time, you won't do the camp stuff. Oh no, too late. Whoops. You remember the camp stuff? Everyone was really mad about it. But now What's up, f***s? Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment if you want. And make sure to subscribe to our podcast, Even More News, wherever podcasts are available, like apps and websites. And we've got a patreon.com/somemore-news if you want to support us via that website. And we've got merch with this f***er's face on it. And other stuff too, if you like that. I'm sorry for calling you f***s. That was not necessary.
Our main story tonight concerns, I'm sorry to say, Tucker Carlson, a man who gives Tuckers an even worse name than they already have. This week, as he now seems to every week,
The man-made ecological and economic Hey, everyone. Sorry, it's gonna be a minute. I'm trying to figure out our HR management app, and I just forgot the password. Security questions. Anus shape. Okay, I'm just gonna... Katie! Hello! I know you can hear and see me. Those stuffed owls are clearly cameras.
Oh, hey, buddy. Just randomly checking in to see how my favorite news host is doing.
Yeah, hey. Where's my bathroom?
I'm sorry?
My entire bathroom is missing.
Did you go through the app?
The app wants to know about my anus.
Well, it is the body's fingerprint.
Where is my bathroom?
Listen, Cody, I hear you. I see you through those owls. And you took just too many pisses on company time. I do not pay you to piss, man. You get paid to consume the news, process it, and then shoot it out at the camera. I want you to eat news and crap news also. You sweat, you bleed, and you piss news, man.
This is my home. You took my home bathroom. Where am I going to pee now?
Pee in a bottle. Pee in your pants. I don't care. The camera's only waist up anyway. Just figure it out for yourself for once. Be creative. Be a thought leader, Cody. All right, good talk. I'm off to go play executive sushi golf.
Executive sushi golf?
Yeah, you play golf, but with sushi into each other's mouths.
That seems kind of gross.
Yeah, okay, like I'm gonna listen to what Admiral Piss Pants thinks is gross. Okay, break time's over. Remember to give this 110%. Wait, no, better make it 111%. Bye.
111%? But that's more of my all than exists. Anyway, back to the news. One second. All right, sorry about that. Boy, working kind of sucks, right? It's not exactly popular right now either. In fact, here is some news. According to the leading experts, nobody wants to work anymore.
You guys have stayed open the entire time, but as it's reopened and mandates have been lifted, it's tough to hire people right now, right?
Yes, nobody really wants to work. Everybody is staying home. Why do work if he can't collect the money and the government is feeding them? So I don't think it's a good idea. They should stop it, and it's good for the people and good for the business, then good for the country, good for the economy.
Why is there a demand for labor and seemingly high unemployment, but we can't marry the two?
Well, I mean, I don't think anybody everybody's wanting to say it, but with unemployment and the stimulus and tax income, everyone's kind of saying, you know, I make more at home. They make more on unemployment. They make more with these benefits, and they're just not wanting to go to work.
The government's made it too easy. Just basically all the stimulus money and then the extra money on the unemployment, and then extending the unemployment for people that have just been on unemployment. They make more money to stay home than work.
Did I say leading experts? I meant random people and business owners being asked to speculate as to why there's a hiring crisis in order to push a specific narrative without having to consult actual experts who might not reach the same conclusion. Also, Kim Kardashian, apparently. And according to those experts, it turns out that after the pandemic, all of America's working class became listless and self-centered loafmongers suckling on handouts from that socialist Uncle Sam, Donald Trump. No need to look into the deets around how all the low-wage work, which we rely on in the US, has become more cumbersome, stressful, and often traumatic during this pandemic. No, that would be too cumbersome and stressful and often traumatic to acknowledge. Also, geez, I don't know. If giving people like $600 a week for unemployment turns out to be more money than what they made doing a service job, perhaps the finger pointing could be aimed at the people paying dirt wages, or at the very least, maybe the news could ask the people on unemployment about why they aren't going back to work instead of the people running the businesses. Or heck, perhaps they could point out that the deadly pandemic that killed nearly 1 million people and caused lasting side effects might have something to do with people not rushing back to the office. Or by golly gee whiz, perhaps one of these reporters can open a fucking laptop and clack a few type words to see if unemployment benefits have any kind of historical or measurable connection with causing people to not look for work. Because it turns out that there are a bunch of studies all concluding that no, unemployment benefits do not slow down the labor market recovery. It's simply not true. These are all things that the media could have done instead of sticking a mic in the face of a storekeeper or a rich celebrity who inherited a bunch of her money, or in one of those clips, just a random nurse who took a viral photo and asked them to speculate why people aren't working, and then run with their answers like they were the fucking lords of facts. But instead of doing any of that, the second those "no one wants to work anymore" memes started popping up in 2021, we saw the news jump on this narrative like a bunch of corny squirrels, followed by a series of Republican governors ending crucial unemployment benefits during a pandemic to try to force people into low-paying, often unsafe jobs. A few signs at a Wendy's suddenly became proof that America's working class were living high on the hog and taking advantage of completely unnecessary unemployment benefits, distributed at a time when only 35% of US adults had received 2 shots of a coronavirus vaccine. Not to mention that most of these same governors slashing unemployment benefits and declaring it's time for America to get back to work were doing so while banning mandates for vaccines and masks and being generally super duper wrong about how and when the pandemic would end. Of course, it's always those dipshit GOPs, isn't it? And by dipshit GOP, I of course also mean President Joe Biden.
We're going to make it clear that anyone collecting unemployment who is offered a suitable job must take the job or lose their unemployment benefits. It's time for America to get back to work and fill our great downtowns again with people. People working from home can feel safe and begin to return to their offices. We're doing that here in the federal government.
Hey Joe, I know you're like 90 and live in your office, but most people have this thing called the internet now, and shouldn't be required to physically go into work for all kinds of jobs, no matter how much those sad downtown buildings miss us. Surely we can think of a new use for a bunch of lonely buildings in a time where people are struggling to find affordable housing. Also, maybe we live in a time when people shouldn't have to take the first suitable job under the penalty of starving, where COVID-related side effects are still incredibly hard to diagnose and could result in seriously sick people being shoved back into the workforce. Maybe there are worse things out there than someone leaning on unemployment benefits a little longer than they should, and most finaliest of all, just possibly, maybe, perhaps, after several years of being paid dirt wages and killed off for the sake of the economy and amassing serious anxiety and medical problems, the last thing anyone struggling in the workforce actually wants to hear is how having a job equates to having your dignity back.
My dad used to have an expression. He said, Joey, a job's about a lot more than a paycheck. It's about your dignity. And then he'd say, Joey, a job is about a lot more than a paycheck. It's about your dignity. It's about respect. It's about your place in the community. Yes, family budgets are still tight, but a lot of Americans are getting paychecks this year more than they got last year, and restoring the dignity of work so they can show up at work with some pride.
Yes, dignity. 1 second, hold on. Right. Sorry, I had a lot of coffee this morning. Didn't expect my bathroom to be torn from my apartment. Anyway, nothing says dignity more than going to a place you hate for 8 hours a day. This framing from the president that work is dignified and that it's sad that no one wants to work anymore to apparently fill our struggling skyscrapers is all, as you might have noticed, from the perspective of the people in charge of these workplaces. And so what I'm getting at here is that post-ish the pandemic, it seems that a lot of Americans who aren't running a business or office are wondering just why they're expected to work long hours for very little money. They do not, as Biden keeps putting it, see the dignity in that. And yet at the same time, a lot of, let's call them the more wealth-inclined individuals, well, they see this as the common folk getting a little too big for their britches instead of, say, the beginnings of a workers' revolution in this country. And I guess my question now is, which is it? Did a massive unemployment system create a nation of people who want to make money doing nothing? Or perhaps are workers finally realizing their value? Is it wrong to even complain in these modern times compared to the olden days of black-lunged children hand-shoveling toxic rat turds for penny slivers? Or perhaps we shouldn't compare the worst labor moments of our history with today as a way to justify contemporary problems? See, it seems like it's that last thing. You know, seems extremely obviously like it's the last thing. But wait! Perhaps we actually should look at history as a whole when talking about labor in this country after all. I know I literally just said we shouldn't, but while there certainly were worse times to be a worker, there were also way better times as well. In fact, you might argue that the concept of working was actually much better for the majority of history before now. And that only for a very tiny sliver of our existence as sapiens, you know, the humankind. Have we been expected to expend energy in the service of some other non-personal goal for so much of our lives? So darn, let's, I don't know, talk about that. Are you ready?
With you died on
Oh yeah, I am so ready! So no better place to start. Time for ads. What the hell?
You like it? Instead of a toilet, you now have a giant speaker that tells you when to cut to ads. Unfortunately, it is on a timer and cannot be turned off during non-working hours, though.
You serious?
Or like, I don't want to turn it off? I forget which. Either it can't be or I won't let it turn off. Point is, you need to do an ad break.
I was just starting. Time for ads.
Oof, better cut to ads, pissy.
Okay! Wow, fine. Great, let's cut to the ads. Hey! Listen here! Are you worried about saving money? Perhaps your boss gave you a pay cut because of your, quote, fancy beard. Well, one way to save on money this year is by switching over to Mint Mobile. They offer premium widely traded any on your sticky
off your first 3 bags. Bye now.
One moment. Okay, super, and we're back from ads! And as I was back from ads. Why? Okay, so we were about to talk about the history of work, and no better place to start than the beginning of our entire species. No, really. Sounds whack and or bogus, but human beings have existed with essentially the bodies and minds we have today for like 200,000 years. Unfortunately, we don't have much info on that first 190,000-ish years, but if you look at the indigenous communities that managed to maintain their traditional hunter-gatherer structures into the modern era, those groups worked, on average, about 15 hours a week. One group of people from southern Africa, which managed to live as hunter-gatherers until the 1970s, had plenty of time and energy to devote to leisure, and operated in a system whereby individual attempts to either accumulate or monopolize resources or power were met with derision and ridicule, which sounds pretty fun, if I'm being honest. Researchers believe that most hunter-gatherer societies, which again, is how we humans lived for the vast majority of our history, spent most of their time on purposeful activities such as making music, exploring, decorating their bodies, and socializing. You know, things only communists like to do. Some even theorize that these pinko Homo sapiens were only able to develop language because of all of this free time. And that makes sense. If you're laboring for 14 hours a day, that doesn't leave you a lot of time to yak about your opinions around the water cooler, which back then was called a river. Now, I'm not trying to go all edgelord Tyler Durden on everyone and propose we all revert back to the days of hunting and or gathering, preferably with robot dinosaurs like in that Horizon game. That would be pretty sweet. And so I guess I'm actually proposing that. But what I'm trying to say here is that perhaps the human brain wasn't exactly built to be in a work task mode for 40 plus hours a week, and in fact didn't operate this way for the majority of our history. Even in the most socially unequal and brutal societies, and yes, they were unequal and brutal, most people still didn't work as much as they do today. In medieval England, working days would typically not last longer than 8 hours and were notable for leisurely meals, naps, refreshment breaks, and banging two coconuts together in order to comically simulate the sound of a horse. And given how crops have both on and off seasons and the harvest is not year-round, most people had holiday time lasting about 1/3 of the year. And those Brits of the 16th century were probably themselves overdoing it a little. In the later Middle Ages, like the top half of the middle of the ages, I guess, people in Spain typically had 5 months of time off per year, and entire peasant families around Europe would usually only work until they had earned what they needed for the year, after which they would stop. They would stop working. That's a choice people could make in the past, I guess. They would look at the amount of money they had and say, well, that's all the money I'll need, and then just stop making money for the year. And that was possible because for some wild reason, these people didn't think making money was the most important thing in life. So what exactly happened? Well, that would be a thing called the Industrial Revolution. Now, first off, a little historical housekeeping. There were actually two industrial revolutions, the first involving a rapid expansion of machine processes, including steam power and mechanization from 1760 until around 1840, and the second involving the mass industrialization of American and European production and labor, plus the adoption of new technological achievements like railroads, sewer systems, electricity, and stuff like that, lasted from the late 19th century until about World War I. I'm going to just say the Industrial Revolution over the next few minutes, and I'm gonna need you to stick with me on the general understanding that a lot changed during this 150-year period of time. And some stuff happened in the first Industrial Revolution, and other stuff happened in the second. And you should really just get off my ass about it. What are you, King History? I think not. You're an Earl at best. Now, the Industrial Revolution is often thought about just in terms of factories, long hours, workplace accidents, and novels where even the Cliff's Notes were a struggle to get through. But this is also the era where modern capitalistic institutions like credit, stock markets, and incorporation became commonplace. The entire idea that most individuals would work for a company and get paid a wage, nowadays just accepted as if there could be no alternative, came out of the rapid expansion of non-agrarian industries during the Industrial Revolution. The impact this era still has on us today is pretty incalculable. Our cities swelled, railroads were built to connect them all, and an economic system that relied on low-wage workers suffering through harsh conditions was established. The attitude of laissez-faire capitalism in this era meant that the government set very few regulations as to worker treatment, hours, or conditions. Working 16 hours a day in a mine or factory wasn't uncommon. Workers were often either denied breaks or docked pay during their breaks, and frequently had to perform maintenance on machines while they ate lunch. And you have to remember, in late 19th century America, this probably seemed like an improvement for much of the country, given the US had only recently started dismantling its much more horrifying system of having millions of no-wage workers just a few decades before. Without any regulation, companies had carte blanche to work employees as tough as they wanted. Between that and the newly developed machines those workers operated, production increased. Production meant more goods to sell and export, and more money coming into the companies that had figured out how to use technology and labor efficiently. Much like today, the people who got rich off of this increased productivity didn't want to share all of the money coming in with their workers. Unlike today, they didn't have an outlet for their totally epic weed sex inflation jokes. Do you get it? Do you get it? The guy who runs segregated factories said the funny numbers. Do you get it? But, also unlike today, the classic robber barons of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were probably, and this is going to sound wrong to you at first, hoarding less in profits than today's wealthiest people. No, really, it is much worse now. You might have heard that John D. Rockefeller, the founder of the Standard Oil Company, was the richest American who ever lived, if you adjust for inflation. But Rockefeller died in 1937 with a net worth of $1.4 billion, which would be about $27 billion today, far below your Gateses and Buffettses and Zuckerbergses. That richest person ever line only comes from calculating Rockefeller's wealth as a percentage of GDP at the time. It's a minor distinction, and look, Rockefeller wasn't like a good dude, but it's part of this overall narrative that intensive, unfair work and the massive hoarding of wealth was a product of a bygone era. So given that the Industrial Revolution and the now times both feature long hours, low wages, often unsafe working conditions, and massive amounts of wealth flowing to the richest 1%, the major difference between then and now is that the struggle was a lot more blatant and violent back during this time. In 1877, when railroad workers went on strike to protest reduced wages, states gathered militias of more than 60,000 to put them down, leading to the deaths of 10 people in Cumberland, Maryland. A decade later, workers rallied in Chicago to support the standardization of an 8-hour workday. They were attacked by cops, an action which led to more rallies, and ultimately, anarchist violence against the police. Since labor leaders were blamed for the violence, this incident is said to have served as a setback for the labor movement. That was in 1886. The 8-hour workday was won gradually over the ensuing decades, but didn't become codified into law for most US workers until the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938. So despite mobilizing since we had a president named Millard, it took forever to see the visible fruits of these actions, like the 40-hour work week, child labor laws, the minimum wage, and, ladies and gentlemen, the weekend. Those protections, won largely in the first third of the 20th century, provided a significant benefit to American workers after World War II. After the war, more people were able to pursue what they wanted to for employment instead of spending all day building tanks, shells, and, this is true, bat bombs. But also, after declining in the 1920s, union membership surged during the Great Depression, World War II, and then peaked in the mid-1950s. Working hours for most stabilized at around 40 hours per week. Worker injuries declined, and some workers were even able to save for retirement because of profit-sharing incentives at companies. In one of the most prominent examples of the benefits of this kind of arrangement, Sears earmarked 10% of its pre-tax earnings for a profit-sharing program with workers. By the 1950s, Sears employees owned a quarter of the company. The union membership of this era is credited with earning workers additional benefits, including regular pay raises, healthcare, and retirement packages. The US was able to sustain a robust middle class that allowed a single individual working as an insurance agent, bus driver, or mambo band leader to afford a comfortable life, maybe own a house, have children, and even take a vacation once in a while. And that was because, and this is pretty key, we fought for those things over a long period of time. Now, don't think I'm gonna spend the next amount of time waxing nostalgic about the 1950s. Don't get me wrong, the 1950s sucked. Racist housing and banking laws kept most non-white people from purchasing property. Safe and legal abortions were unavailable to all but the affluent. The CIA started having a real fun time overthrowing the governments of other countries. And one of the hottest comedies on TV was produced by a fucking toothpaste company. But the correlation between robust union efforts and broader protections for workers is readily apparent, and it's one of the artifacts of post-World War II America that might have made things better for workers today. Unfortunately, the strength of unions, and thus the power of the American worker to maintain a reasonable working day for good pay, started a steady, decades-long decline during this period. This was due to a number of factors, such as manufacturing jobs moving overseas, allegations of corruption, and most notably, a political scene that promoted irrational and frequently racist fears about communism. After World War II, the Congress of Industrial Organizations launched a campaign to promote unionization among workers in the South called Operation Dixie. This effort was partially undercut by the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, which restricted the power of labor unions and set the stage for dozens of states to establish right-to-work laws, further exempting companies from having to negotiate with unions when hiring. But it also failed because industries took advantage of conditions in the Jim Crow South to stoke fears and prevent black and white workers from organizing together. Institutionalized racism, you probably be terribly shocked to find out, was one of the primary catalysts for the decline of unions in America. People at the time, much like today, would try to find other dog-whistly ways of saying the racist thing without using overtly racist language. But since this was the 50s, you could just call someone a closet communist, light up a Lucky Strike, slap a child, and then move on. But believe it or not, even as union membership started to decline in the US, compensation for workers still kept going up until about the early 1980s, when, Ronald Reagan and his flagrant disdain for workers led to the firing of thousands of air traffic controllers in 1981 who were striking for a pay raise and shorter work week. And his monster tax cuts for the rich hollowed out the middle class and led to 4 decades of politicians saying, maybe if we give all the rich people more money again, this time it will trickle down, mommy. Despite the fact that this has never, ever, ever happened. And that's what leads us to charts like this and the way we all work today. A system where every adult pretty much has to work at capacity all of the time just to hang on to whatever bottom rung of a ladder we have been presented with. We covered that most recent era, from Reagan to the present, pretty thoroughly in a video a few months ago, and not to toot my own bulbous horn, but we did a decent job laying out why modern American workers, particularly millennials, are so frustrated at what we inherited. But between 1979 and 2018, productivity jumped another 69.6%, and compensation grew by just 11.6%. In other words, we're working our asses off and inheriting very little in return. So, I don't know, maybe let us have our stupid green toast. Man, what was I thinking with that beard? Ugh. So to recap, union membership has been on the decline for decades, despite union workers earning 19% more on average than non-union workers. The largest block of workers in the US has lower wages, works longer hours, and are generally unhappy with their jobs. So why doesn't it change? Well, that's a very good question that deserves a whole bunch of words coming out of this pretty mouth of mine, which will happen right after these ads, so just sit tight. Time for ads. I was literally just doing the ad thing. Let's do. All right, we're gonna do the ad. Ad break in 3. Let me do the ads. We're doing it. 2. I can do the ad. Ads.
Cereal. It's a thing that this ad is for. We love cereal. We love it with our various milks, or an ice cream, or ground into a fine powder and sprinkled on pasta. It was the best part of being a puny, weak little child, at least in part because most cereal is just like compacted sugar that we feed our spawn. And that's why I want to tell you about Magic Spoon grain-free cereal. Unlike other cereals, Magic Spoon has 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and only 4 net grams of carbs in each serving. It is keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, and low-carb, all while coming in a huge variety of flavors to choose from. What kind of flavors, you ask? Maws open with sloppy hunger. I'm talking about cocoa, fruity, frosted, peanut butter, cookies and cream, and more. You can mix and match, or perhaps pour a box out on the ground and roll around in it like your dog at the dog park. And the best part is that you can enjoy it totally guilt-free and start your day with something healthy for a change. So go to magicspoon.com/morenews and use our promo code MORENEWS at checkout to save $5 off your order. It's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason, they will refund your money. No questions asked. That's right, get your next delicious bowl of guilt-free cereal at magicspoon.com/morenews and use the code MORENEWS to save $5 off of cereal.
Well, we're back from ads. So we're back from ads. And we were talking about the history of how work in this country became all-encompassing, and why now, in these exhausting times, our society seems barely able to change that. Not because it isn't possible, but rather that the people in power, as well as a lot of workers, seem actually unwilling to do anything. So why is that? Well, for one thing, it's kind of the same reason most of us still sing happy birthday when it's someone's birthday. It's what we were always taught to do. Seems innocuous enough at first glance, and it might be a little uncomfortable if you just suggested something else out of the blue. Even though Crazy Town's Butterfly is a really bad song, is it really worse than Happy Birthday? It's possible people might prefer it. Or maybe we can just sit in silence while the cake is brought out. There's no reason we can't, but we will probably keep singing Happy Birthday, right? Who's gonna spearhead a movement to change that? You? Me? I can't even shit in a toilet anymore. I have to use the garbage disposal, which is really just me wiggling a butter knife around down there. Of course, there are some other reasons we work the way we do as well, some of them uniquely American, and we will split these into two categories, starting with the cultural reasons. You've perhaps heard of something called the Protestant work ethic, the idea that a significant chunk of the American identity comes from the teaching and work of Protestant theologians Martin Luther and John Calvin, which is that work, it's built into our bones, and we wouldn't even want to live any other way. And sure, I guess you can find some examples to back this up. There have been surveys in the past finding that most Americans like their jobs, and that many people, especially if they don't work in the private sector, glean a certain amount of meaning and pride from their work. There's nothing wrong with taking pride in the work you're putting in. You think Prince Goro enjoys shoving someone's head into their torso and then ripping off the front of their chest so they look like Krang from Ninja Turtles? No, he does that because the work needs to get done. Also, he probably enjoys it. However, this idea of work ethic is strongly tied in with the concept of American exceptionalism. It is often used as the expectation for how people should work, often as a political point used to alienate those who don't feel this way. It's good that some people enjoy work, but we shouldn't assume everyone does. When Rand Paul announced his, excuse me while I stifle laughter here, 2016 presidential campaign, he strongly delivered this message and countered what he saw as a nation struggling with its work ethic.
From an early age, I worked. I taught swimming lessons, I mowed lawns, I did landscaping, I put roofs on houses, I painted houses. I never saw work, though, as punishment. Work always gave me a sense of who I am. Self-esteem can't be given, it must be earned. Work is not punishment, work is the reward.
Ah, yes, work is the reward. Mowing lawns and teaching kids how to swim. I bet Rand Paul had a lucrative lemonade stand and a paper route to deliver his dad's racist newsletters. Of course, you can tell what kind of person he's visualizing while promoting the American work ethic, given that he's previously said that only unemployed people use heroin, and that he's glad his train didn't stop in Baltimore during protests over the death of Freddie Gray. It seems pretty clear exactly who he considers the Americans with a strong work ethic. Also, and maybe this is obvious, but when it comes to jobs, the money is the reward. Paul's ideas, though, go way back. It's taken as a given in American life that working oneself to the bone is the innate and natural order of things, and not something that was developed over time by the capitalists in charge and the economic conditions they have created. The phrase Protestant work ethic was not part of some holy Anglo-American doctrine passed down from... Where are things passed down from? Like a mountain? Gross. No, the phrase was coined by the German sociologist Max Weber in his 1905 book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Weber argues that the Protestant mindset that took root hundreds of years ago was essential to ending feudalism and creating our modern, market-driven capitalist system. The theory suggests that Protestants valued work and success more than those who practiced other religions, and that Calvinist branches of Protestantism frowned upon donating money to the poor or to charity because it was seen as promoting beggary. And you know what? Fine. If your religious worldview is that it's best to work hard and never be a burden on anyone else and prove you can be more productive than the next guy and not give to charity, then sure. Do that. I mean, you'd be a nerd and wrong and kind of a dick, whatever, but that shouldn't be the foundation for an entire system. It's not something we should expect everyone to do, and it leads to the persistent and very untrue assumptions that rich people are rich because they work harder than poor people, that the working class is lazy, and that your grandmother should be happy to die so that the Dow can cross 40,000. In fact, even Weber recognized that people wouldn't have to share those values in order to be forcefully integrated into the system. And that would be shitty, but of course he was right. And this leads us into the more modern version of the Protestant work ethic. Hustle culture! Hashtag rise and grind, get rich or die grinding. The grind leading the grind hard with a vengeance! Yes, in 2022, instead of toiling in the wheat field for 10 hours and spying on your neighbor who's taking a bit too long of a break, we've got Instagram to prove we work longer and harder than anyone else. Of course, work in this sense is typically flexing with your hands loosely rested on weights, or flexing while in the ocean and arrows rain down on your wings. What is that guy? Some kind of angel? Or like, did somebody f*** a seagull and birth him, and all the townsfolk are horrified and trying to shoot him while he retreats into the ocean, only to be tragically rejected by his avian brethren and be doomed to wander the earth without a home? That's terrible! Why can't we accept this Birdman for who he is? What was I talking about? Oh, right, hustle culture. If you search on Twitter or Instagram for things like hashtag hustle or hashtag Monday motivation, you'll see a mix of imagery seemingly designed to blur the lines between work and leisure. And this is something that ultra-rich capitalists are only too happy to reinforce. Billionaire Richard Branson said, "Fun is one of the most important ingredients in any successful venture." JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon said, "Remote work does not work for young people or those who want to hustle." You got that? Everyone under 45, you're young and fresh-faced, maybe you have wings. You work hard and you play hard, as long as that playing hard involves working hard. The concept of a side hustle is so commonplace in our discourse that it's easy to forget that it's just like another job. It's played off as a fun way to follow your dreams, but the sad truth is that the number of Americans having to take second jobs has been increasing over the last 2 decades. But this is a good thing, right? Articles online? It is like clockwork. Anytime something happens in the US economy that looks like a detriment to American workers, there will be an article somewhere to make it seem like all additional work is just a fun piece of the ultimate success puzzle. And it's actually necessary, as billionaires will always say, if you want to get to where they are. Because of course, hard work equals success, right? Not successful? You must not have worked hard enough. Kind of successful, but not as rich as you want to be? You simply didn't work as hard as the billionaire, who clearly works harder than everyone else. What's the evidence for that? Well, him, of course. The wise billionaire said so. You just have to put in 80 to 100-hour weeks every week, Elon Musk says. If other people are putting in 40-hour work weeks and you're putting in 100-hour work weeks, then even if you're doing the same thing, you know that you will achieve in 4 months what it takes them a year to achieve. That's right, people are just optimally productive no matter how much they work. You know how you work just as hard in the 12th hour of your shift as your 3rd hour? If you would just put in 100 hours a week at Sur La Table, you definitely would have made shift man a J. The thing about this, though, is that it's totally not true. A 2014 study from Stanford found that increased working hours typically results in less productivity, which drops sharply above 50 weekly hours. What a big surprise! Once people are working more than 55 hours in a week, they're barely getting anything done and might as well have not tried. There's a great amount of value in rest, and a number of studies have found that taking regular breaks and literally doing nothing helps improve our mood and makes us more productive when we are working. A 2015 study from Australia found that the stress associated with working more than just 25 hours a week caused cognitive decline in people over 40. A body of research suggests that we're most productive in 90-minute work periods, separated by breaks, with the most successful performers working in 3 90-minute sessions a day. Our brains simply didn't evolve to focus on work-related tasks for 8 or more hours consecutively. But what about those executives who say they work 100 hours a week? Well, the thing about them is, they're liars. It's a lie. By big, stupid, rich liars. Well, what's Elon doing anyway? Spending the night at the Tesla factory, tightening panels on his shitty cars, slaving away on Twitter every day? What I'm getting at is that what these rich CEOs consider work is not what you or I or most people would ever consider work. Back when Quibi was a beautiful, soft, fleeting thing, the media was desperate to frame CEO Jeffrey Katzenberg as a really hard worker who wakes up at 2:30 a.m. just to get all of his work done. But of course, he didn't really have anything to do other than approve or disapprove of what all of his employees, the people actually doing the work, were creating. What he considered work was what the New York Times described as 3 breakfast meetings, 3 lunch meetings, and a working dinner. So, eating and talking. Not exactly the hardest job in the world, especially since he's the boss and everyone has to do what he tells them. It might get a little tiresome greenlighting Chrissy Teigen court shows over an egg white omelet in a fruit bowl, but it's got to be a lot easier than like an actual job. And when it comes to Elon, don't forget that he's the CEO of 4 companies: Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and the Boring Company. That's the one that does the traffic simulating death tunnel so he can sell dirt to the poor, even though he hasn't actually done that yet. So even if he was telling the truth about 100-hour weeks, that means he's working about 25 hours as the CEO of each company. He is just admitting to us that being a CEO is not a full-time job. Could it possibly be that taking meetings and telling people what to do isn't all that hard? If you have a full-time job, think about if you would be able to do even 2 of them, let alone 4, and still have time left over to come up with absolutely killer content like this. I think he's close to having a packet ready for the Corden show. So at the end of the day, there's simply no shame in not working 100 hours or 80 hours or 40 hours or even 0 hours a week. People telling you otherwise are either misinformed or liars or jerks. This Joe Biden work is dignity and corporate fantasy that is somehow in our nature to sit in a box for 8 hours a day is silly and wrong. And you could argue that it's a smokescreen for the other main driver of our current life-work imbalance, which is economic. Specifically, the need for constant growth, measured in an extremely f***ed up way. Now, this is going to be a vast oversimplification of hundreds of years of economic theory, but the idea is that workers and companies and manufacturers over time get more efficient and are able to turn out more productivity with fewer resources. That results in more profit coming in, which grows the organization and provides more value to its workers, who make more money and thus ensure that each generation is more prosperous than the last. At least, that's how it's supposed to work. I don't know if you've noticed, but subsequent generations aren't making more money than previous generations, even though they have become more productive. And yet this overwhelming goal of increased GDP growth still takes precedence. What is the GDP? I am glad you asked, even though I can't hear you and was going to explain anyway. Gross domestic product is estimated by looking at the total value of all of the goods and services produced in an economy in a period of time. Economists say that that number should go up every year. If it goes down for 2 years in a row, we're in a recession, and that's bad. It's bad for you, it's bad for your job, bad for your little puppy, or your kitty, or like your lizard, you absolute weirdo. It's a measurement that came out of the Great Depression, when governments were looking for a single overarching statistic to examine when determining if an economy was healthy or unhealthy. GDP, however, is not the objective benchmark for which we should judge human well-being. First of all, it leaves a lot of things out. Unpaid home labor and childcare doesn't show up on any balance sheet and won't contribute to what economists consider a nation's productivity. Neither do educational metrics or increasing diversity in the American workplace or the health of a population. You know, things we really should be focusing on as a nation, and which won't be the priority of a federal government that is singularly focused on GDP and economic growth as a measure of how the country is doing. Imagine judging a child solely based on their standardized test scores, and how that wouldn't even begin to paint a true picture of that individual. The GDP is such a poor measurement that even things that are unquestionably bad can have a positive impact on it. For example, Oil spills increased GDP. The Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989 and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010 were good for the U.S. economy, since drilling for oil is economic productivity, as is the spending of resources cleaning it up. Other things that raise GDP include spending on bombs and fighter jets, increased police budgets, burning coal, and the millions of pounds of food we purchase and then throw out every year. Anytime you have spent on hold with a health insurance company after a starving ferret bit off your big toe, it was probably good for GDP, and also good for the starving ferret who now has a full belly of toe. Also, your work insurance doesn't cover ferret attacks, I'm sorry to say. Because of the need for constant growth, companies are incentivized to think in the short term, prioritizing quarterly revenue over the long-term health of the company or anything else. Why would corporations care about climate change, eliminating vaccine patents, or treating their employees fairly when all of their economic incentives point in the opposite direction, and when there are basically no consequences for being giant dicks? If Chipotle's punishment for running a Dickensian burrito factory is 1/50th of 1% of their annual revenue, they're gonna keep doing it. I mean, those little child hands can really roll the burritos nice and tight. I get it. I often force children to make my food. It's still largely assumed that growth is necessary for our economy to function, even without seeing the expected benefits to anyone who doesn't own equity in that economy. It may just be so profitable that, again, the people making the most money just don't want to admit that it isn't working. But a growing number of economists are starting to question the endless growth mindset. They include pinko, commie anarchists like Nobel Prize-winning economist Michael Spence, who argues that wealthy nations should accept a less robust growth rate and prioritize things like public health and social services. Maybe things that would have long-term positive effects beyond quarterly earnings. That's interesting. Weird. There's also Peter Victor, a hacky sack playing doobie-noodling prize-winning economist who argues that emphasizing growth necessarily leads to a disregard for the environment and the well-being of workers. He's written multiple books suggesting that economies can stagnate while still keeping unemployment low, providing a high quality of life for the people working in them, and decrease greenhouse gas emissions. Victor says one of the big upsides to stagnating growth, or even decreasing our growth rate, is that we would all work a lot less. And it would be helpful across the board. When technology improves enough so that it takes less time to build the widget that tightens the bolt that maintains the machine at the banana slicer factory, the current workers could simply share in the benefits instead of half of the workers being laid off. And for the first time in modern economic history, the companies themselves wouldn't be incentivized to cut corners because they don't need to show consistent growth 4 times a year in order to justify their own existence. Imagine a banana slicer factory, the steady stream of banana slicer workers not under constant pressure to produce more banana slicers every shift. And heck, on that subject of bananas, imagine planting a banana tree right now. You stick the seed in, you water it, you pray to Satan for a bountiful harvest, and then you watch it grow, right? It grows, and you nurture it, and then it stops. It stops growing, and you then harvest those bananas. They are the dick-shaped reward for all of that growth. It would be weird if you just kept trying to make that tree grow, never picking those dick-shaped rewards out of some weird dogmatic obsession with the concept of growth. And so that's really what I'm getting at here. The same way we no longer have to build a fire with a couple of sticks, perhaps we've evolved to a point where we also don't have to work so much, especially considering that thing I said earlier about how our cave people ancestors didn't used to work so much and then invented language. After all, isn't this the entire point of our efforts? The Jetsons' future? Now, you probably don't know this because you're not 90, but in that 1960s show about the year 2062, George Jetson only worked 2 hours a week. And the wild part is that right now, only 40 years before that deadline, there's no reason we can't make that happen. We are on the cusp of robotic workers, self-driving trucks, and I don't see a reason we can't make those stupid Elroy hats with like the rings on them, you know the ones. But the only way to do that is for everyone to collectively realize that our current culture around work is false and bad. Unfortunately, I'm not sure a lot of us would know what they do if they only worked a few hours a week. Now, what I mean is that everyone in the workforce, from the humble barista to the blowhardiest stockbroker to even me, we all likely have a similar problem where our job, the thing we do to pay rent and buy food and subscribe to really cool online videos, has become our identity. This manifests itself in all sorts of ways. There is a reason why Smith, Miller, and Taylor are among the most popular last names in the United States. But critically, using your job as the basis for your identity focuses your attention on social status. Your work is no doubt also your social life. It's often our opener subject with strangers, and some economists have even theorized that the greater the disparity between rich and poor in a society, the more all of the participants in that society fixate on status. And that, of course, creates a cycle. The people at the bottom see those at the top as a work aspiration. The people at the top need to justify their status, and instead of crediting, their father's emerald mine or whatever, attribute their position to hard work. They even begin to believe their own lie, and an entire society gets built around this idea that having more money makes you a better person, and therefore the goal of everyone is to gain wealth. Laws get built upon it. Lower wage workers are treated like objects and sacrificed during a pandemic. The ones that survive have to deal with a barrage of entitled baby behavior from customers who feel as if their status is higher. So much so that a lot of them are offended by the idea of these people getting better wages, as if that invalidates their own positions. And tragically, those service employees have to just take it, because rent is due, the kids are hungry, and perhaps they even believe that the more they're forced to eat, the closer they get to increasing their own status. Keep working, keep hustling, keep climbing, until you also become rich, or at least afford a comfortable life. But, and this is very important, the vast majority of us will never ever be rich. I mean, I will, because I play the ponies and I have a system. But most of us, a staggering amount, won't be, ever. To put this in perspective, right now, we actually have more millionaires than ever before. Close to 22 million Americans have assets totaling over $1 million. Except that's still about 6% of the country. But more important to note, there are also more poor people than ever before, because the policies that created all of those millionaires also destroyed the middle class. In other words, as it stands right now, the pathway from minimum wage worker to dough-rolling moneybags is very much sealed shut. They lock that door on their way out, you see. And yet our culture continues to dangle that carrot as if it's not a mirage. It's this.
Why are you cheering, Fry? You're not rich.
True, but someday I might be rich, and then people like me better watch their step.
So glad that's coming back. Perfect moment from a perfect show. Anyway, while ending the pursuit of wealth may seem like a bleak proposal in a time when it seems like the only way to survive, to own a home, to retire, realizing that we'll never actually get rich forces everyone to consider how important it is to have a system that caters to the working class, that encourages everyone to push for a system for people to realistically and comfortably exist in, to de-emphasize the cultural expectations to work long hours, and perhaps pivot to the importance of family and friends and relaxation and maybe even a fun new language we can all invent together to actually get us to that future our grandparents worked toward. On the plus side, there's some evidence that this is already happening. A recent Pew Research survey found that fewer Americans than ever see work as a major source of meaning in their lives, and recent union action, the wave of worker strikes, and the popularity of subreddits like anti-work suggest that we're correctly starting to look at our jobs as a way to make money, to pay for stuff, and not the thing that defines us or our value as human beings. If we got one good thing from the pandemic, it's these strikes, and the realization that we are all owed a little bit of dignity in our... Come on!
You like it? I trained it to call you pissy. This is your piss problem from earlier.
You know what, Katie?
What is it, my dumpling?
I'm done. I'm going on strike.
Oh, yeah? Pissy? Okay, well, here's a strike for you. Whoa, why didn't your head explode?
What?
At the last holiday party, I planted an explosive in your brain.
We didn't have a holiday party. Remember the pandemic?
Ugh, what party was that? Well, someone's head just exploded, and that's what's important.
I'm done. Officially on strike. See you never. Just gotta tiptoe around these piss bottles. God, there's so many. Oh God, I got some on me.
Better go through my contacts and see who just exploded. for watching that video. You know the drill. Leave a comment. Hit subscribe, like it, share it. If you enjoyed this, you can check out our Patreon that has other bonus exclusives. You can check out our podcast, even more news. You can listen to this show as a podcast in our podcast feed. And heck, I don't know, man, if you're looking for a job, hit me up. We're looking for
those of you who don't.
So we're gonna watch some movies today. We picked these ahead of time. What is Russian Terminator about?
Programmed to kill, not afraid to die. The Russian Terminator, ellipsis. It just trails off like that. A ruthless underground weapons and drug organization is out to undermine the growing relations between East and West. Their plan is to extort the necessary information from a powerful Western government official by kidnapping his daughter's fiancé. A former FBI agent recruited by the West to wipe out the terrorists and foil their plan. But the KGB has its own strategy for crushing this conspiracy. A mysterious one-man death squad known only as the Russian Terminator. The body count rises quickly as these two warriors race against time and each other in this explosive action adventure. She's got a better name than Russian Terminators.
Yeah!
Yeah.
I think maybe the title was changed, because these all look like actual titles on the film, and that was like superimposed on a freeze frame. We don't have to know what's going on in the scene. Just show people shooting.
It's acceptable so far. It's exciting for a crappy movie. Sure. There's a lot of henchmen though.
That's so they can use the same three actors over and over. So the movie should really be called Russian Ninja.
Oh!
Hey, why did you do that?
You can't hit me at point blank range, you're so slow.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye now.
We got Ninja Vengeance. You can't fight the evil forces of power without the power of force.
What?
The ancient art of the ninja, the invisible assassins of Imperial Japan, is revived by a lone warrior determined to see justice in a small southern town. Traveling from California to Houston, no good. A martial arts expert suffers a motorcycle breakdown in a small Texas town, but his bad luck proves to be a blessing in disguise for the local townspeople when he discovers the corrupt sheriff and his KKK cronies beating a young black student to death. Who was the plot of Doc Hollywood?
Oh my god.
Real-life martial art experts ignite this hard-hitting action-adventure as the fearless disciple gives America a lesson in ninjitude.
What? It does not say that.
Ninjitude. Don't get mad, get vengeance.
A film. Is this a trailer again, or is this?
No, this looks like a movie.
Should have some music or something.
There you go.
Good optical illusion with the bars. Like the fathers of your grandfathers, it was your destiny to become a ninja.
Oh, look at that composition. You can see both of them thanks to mirror. Oh, that's impressive.
The next shot, the cameraman.
I went through it. My teacher went through it. It's a part of the training.
Yeah.
This in and of itself, as the title, you'll see here, Never Too Young to Die. Okay, but then you flip over and you see who's actually in the film, and you will see John Stamos, Vanity, and also listed Gene Simmons.
Yeah.
I just got way more excited.
Who is Vanity?
Vanity? She's a Prince protege.
Oh, okay. So it's she's like, oh man, this is like the perfect movie. Then.
Yeah, but I just flipped over and saw how Gene Simmons looks in this movie.
Yeah. The note that came attached with this said he plays a transsexual villain.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, Gene Simmons is wearing makeup and eyeshadow. Oh boy. All right. Here we go. Now, first off, there is a pull quote right on the top. Explosions, 1 against 100 bazooka battles and chases. That sounds fucking awesome. Vanity, the new breed of Tetris. Stamos, the new breed of hero. Alright, so I'm gonna actually read the back of this now. Past the pull quote. Action, Bond style. Beauty, Vanity style. Hero, American style.
This movie has everything working for it.
I know. Never Too Young to Die stars teenage idol John Stamos and essentially exotic Vanity as two of the most dynamic secret agents seen in years. Gene Simmons plays the supervillain, no shit, who plans to take over the country, no shit, and finds his plot blocked by Stamos and Vanity. We're done. We don't have to watch that. The two suddenly find themselves the targets of the vicious Simmons and must take on the maniacal hermaphrodite.
Oh, a hermaphrodite. Okay. This just keeps getting better.
I know. Okay, powerful heavy metal music, state-of-the-art weaponry, and the explosive chemistry between two of the sexiest stars on the screen blend to make this exciting action flick an automatic winner. Even they know!
Do you just kill her with a finger?
I think so. Meanwhile, in college. Go, Jeans. Excellent choice after. Yeah,
So let's try and decipher Russian terminology.
What do you think the plot was? Somebody wanted the papers and somebody else needed the papers and somebody else stole the papers, but then the one guy had the papers. But then they kidnapped the girl because they thought she had the papers, but she didn't have the papers.
Papers.
Then it was her father who was kidnapping and having the papers all on his papers. They knew where the papers were the whole time. They were in the factory.
This is the paper they want.
Okay, what do we do now?
But there was one paper that was in a different drawer in a different part of the factory.
The thing is that she wasn't even really kidnapped. It was her boyfriend who was kidnapped. And then she had to give them the papers because there was a paper missing from the papers. And her father knew that. And he was paying Kenny Rogers $200,000 to get
clear to what
to get the papers.
I think he was supposed to.
And he was supposed to get the papers, but the dad knew that there was a paper missing.
And we haven't even talked about Phil Davis at all. Phil Davis is Scandinavian. It's some Scandinavian country.
Yeah, so
there's lots of Larses and
yeah, but they're all speaking English, and it becomes clear as you're watching it that this is a movie made by Scandinavians that's meant to be an American action movie about a Russian Terminator. And Phil Davis, maybe it's the case with the other actors, but it's definitely clear with him that he learned his lines phonetically, and English is not a language he's very familiar with.
no, it's like the old man.
Oh, yeah. You're going to make that palace?
Where he's just literally reading the sounds. He has no idea what he's saying. That's how every actor is.
What do you want from me? I'm busy. I don't understand what you're talking about. This girl, Russian doesn't mean.
Yeah, that's how you know where people are putting inflections on long words.
Yes, and it sounds wrong. Oh, yes, which is. Go ahead, Jerry. You read it.
That's what friends are for.
So you help me?
That's what friends are for.
It's obvious, though, that once this movie was completed, someone had to either market it or try and sell it, and the movie has nothing to do with the Russian characters. Minor characters like the Boba Fett.
Well, he's not even a Terminator. He's a ninja.
He's the Russian ninja. They do call him at one point the Russian.
The movie should have been called Russian Ninja.
They just said Russian ninja. Yeah.
I wonder if that was the original title. They changed since it capitalized on the Terminator.
Russian ninja's not a very good title either.
No.
But he's such a minor character. I mean, maybe he's the thing that kind of ties all the betrayals and double crosses all together, but it's not a movie about the Russian Terminator. Old man Rogers walks around, or a Russian title.
Oh, walks around. Walks around looking bored.
Well, he barges into the submersible suites and starts beating the shit out of the guy.
That's some of the highlights of the movie when it's cutting back and forth between those two, having their banter.
We don't talk about one of those days. I've seen one of those before.
Who is this?
It's Phil Davis.
Oh, his name is Phil! That's such an amazing movie. I'm normal American man. Phil Davis.
Did we ever find out why they go to the suites? Like the scene after the scene before that? Yeah, there's a failed robbery. That's when she takes the papers. Yeah.